8. Ghost bomber. An Air National Guard B-25 Mitchell bomber flying from Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada ran out of fuel near Pittsburgh on January 31, 1956. Major William Dodson piloted the plane, which originally sought permission to land at what was then known as Greater Pittsburgh Airport, now Pittsburgh International. Since time was running out, he tried to go to another airport, but the plane malfunctioned. Major Dodson had to make a quick decision and tried to perform a water landing near what is now the Homestead Grays Bridge. The river is very inhospitable, with fast currents and is hard to see. Sadly, the plane crashed and only 4 of the 6 people on board escaped. In the 2 weeks following the accident, the US Coast Guard and Army Corps of Engineers conducted search operations to retrieve the nearly 15-foot-high, 4.5-meter, 13-ton bomber. However, even today, the aircraft hasn't been found. Some allege that the aircraft was retrieved in a hidden midnight operation to keep the specifics of the flight's mission hidden. Other witnesses claim to have seen the bomber being dragged from the sea. Others believe the military retrieved the plane because it was carrying nuclear material, mafia money, and evidence of extraterrestrial activity from Area 51 in Nevada. Searches for the ghost bomber are ongoing. The most likely scenario is that the ship is probably buried under sand and silt. 7. Boeing 727 disappears in Angola. On May 25, 2003, a retired Boeing 727-223 began gliding erratically down the runway at Luanda's Quatro de Fevereiro Airport, with its lights and transponder turned off and no contact between its operators and air traffic control. It took off without permission and flew southwest into the Atlantic Ocean, never to be seen again. The aircraft, which had formerly flown for American Airlines, was being rebuilt to flight condition by the Florida-based company Aerospace Sales and Leasing. Ben Padilla, a trained flight engineer and an airplane technician, was working on it. Padilla boarded the plane shortly before dark on the day it vanished, along with a freshly hired Congolese worker named John Mutantu. The 727 was intended for a 3-person flying crew. Mutantu was not a pilot, and Padilla had just a private pilot certificate. It did, however, leave the runway, but nobody heard from it again. The plane was leased to transport diesel fuel to diamond mines in Angola and had 10 highly combustible 500-gallon fuel tanks. The likelihood of a terrorist strike triggered a frenzy of inquiry among US intelligence agencies, but for unknown reasons, things got quiet. The authorities involved declined to comment, and the FBI concluded its investigation in 2005. Did Padilla and Mutantu face the awaiting hijackers or steal the plane? If so, why? There were several questionable business agreements, unhappy unpaid workers, and other shady situations surrounding the aircraft before its disappearance, as well as employee worries about local violence. However, these conditions cannot explain the plane's disappearance on their own, and the general public may never understand what happened to it. For the time being, hypotheses flourish. It might have sunk after collapsing into the sea. According to one report, the 727 was shot down above Burundi and dismantled for parts. It was the biggest plane ever to vanish without a trace. 6. Flying Tiger Flight 749. During the early phases of the Vietnam War, the United States military hired a Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation propliner, known as Flying Tiger Flight Line 739. It was supposed to transport 93 US Army Ranger experts and 3 Vietnamese soldiers from Travis Air Force Base in California to Saigon, Vietnam in March 1962. After refueling in Guam, the aircraft flew toward Clark Air Base in the Philippines and disappeared without making any distress signals, causing one of the largest sea and air searches in Pacific history. The search was called off after 8 days with no sign of the debris, though a civilian witnessed what seemed to be an in-flight explosion the night before. Nobody knows for sure what happened to Flying Tiger Flight Line 739 to this day. The aircraft had 9.5 hours of gasoline remaining, and just 6 hours remained on its voyage, so it didn't run out of fuel. The Civil Aeronautics Board decided that the aircraft most likely detonated in mid-flight for an unexplained reason, which is regrettably all the closure the relatives of those who died can get. 5. Lady Be Good. Lady Be Good was a B-24D Liberator bomber that went missing on its initial combat flight during World War II. The jet, belonging to the 376th Bomb Group of the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, was thought to have crashed in the Mediterranean Sea while returning to its base in Libya after a bombing attack on Naples on April 4, 1943. On November 9, 1958, an oil prospecting crew from British Petroleum discovered the wreck by accident 710 kilometers, 440 miles inland in the Libyan desert. According to investigators, the crew did not notice they'd overflown their airbase during a desert storm. After several hours of flying south into the desert, the crew ejected when the plane's fuel ran out. The plane continued to fly south after the crew abandoned it. The mainly undamaged wreckage indicates that one engine was still running at the moment of impact. This means the aircraft progressively dropped altitude in a fairly shallow dive and fell on its belly on the flat, open desert floor. The survivors perished in the desert while attempting to walk to safety. Between February and August 1960, all but one of the crew's bodies were retrieved. After being retrieved from the crash site in August 1994, the wreckage of Lady Be Good was transported to a Libyan Air Force installation. 4. Flight 19. On December 5, 1945, just after 2 p.m., 5 TBM Avengers torpedo bombers took off from U.S. Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on a normal navigational training flight led by Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor. Taylor was a seasoned Navy pilot with over 2,500 flight hours and numerous combat tours in the Pacific during World War II. Flight 19 was to carry out Navigation Problem 1, which required them to fly east from Florida coast, perform bombing runs at the Hens and Chicken Shoals, turn north, and then fly across Grand Bahama Island. The final part of the journey was to return to NAS Fort Lauderdale. Except for a thunderstorm, the weather was expected to be quite average. Everything went as planned on the first part of the trip, as they dropped practice bombs without mishap. Trouble began for Flight 19 as the group began to move north for the second leg of the voyage. Taylor's message was received at 3:45 p.m. by Fort Lauderdale's flight tower. He apparently sounded dismayed and concerned. Taylor let the tower know that they were unable to see land and he was afraid that they were off course. The tower was able to respond and ask them what their position was. After a few moments of silence passed, the tower staff looked out and noticed the skies were clear, hoping to see the planes in the direction they were supposed to be, yet they saw nothing. The flight leader repeated that they were unsure of where they were and once again stressed that they weren't able to see land. They lost all contact for 10 minutes, and when they were heard again, it wasn't the flight leader. The voice on the other side said, "We can't find west. Everything is wrong. We can't be sure of any direction. Everything looks strange, even the ocean." It turned out the flight leader had given his command to another pilot, but no one knew why. More time passed, and the new leader said over the transmitter that he felt they were 225 miles, 362 kilometers northeast of the base. Most of it was rambling mixed with hysteria, and finally, he said the last thing that anyone would ever hear from Flight 19. "It looks like we are entering white water. We're completely lost." In just a few minutes, the tower quickly put together 2 PBM Mariner flying boats along with rescue gear. They went in the direction of Flight 19's last known location, which was an estimate, but sadly, that was the last time anyone saw them. A total of 6 planes completely disappeared. The Navy and Coast Guard sent out a search mission covering over 250,000 square miles, 647,497 square kilometers in the Atlantic and the Gulf waters, but they turned up empty. They found no wreckage, rafts, aviators, nothing. Later, the Navy started an investigation, but that came up with no conclusion. Tragically, 14 men lost their lives because of the Flight 19 accident, and 13 lost theirs during the rescue. 77 years later, Flight 19's whereabouts remain a mystery, and the Navy has yet to determine a cause for the accident. 3. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. On October 12, 1972, an old Christians club rented a Uruguayan Air Force aircraft to fly the squad from Montevideo, Uruguay to Santiago, Chile. The twin-engine Fairchild plane was transporting 5 crew members and 40 passengers as they left from Carrasco International Airport. Aside from the club members, friends and relatives were also on board because they were recruited to help pay for the plane's cost. Due to bad weather in the highlands, they had no choice but to stay the night in Mendoza, Argentina, before leaving at 2:18 p.m. the next day. Their location, Santiago, was west of Mendoza, but the Fairchild was unable to fly higher than 22,500 feet, 6,900 meters, so the pilot flew south to the pass of Planchon. This was so the Fairchild could safely clear the Andes. The pilot radioed air controllers that it reached Curacao, Chile, which is roughly 100 miles, 178 kilometers south of Santiago, and was headed north. Unfortunately, he seriously underestimated his location since he was still in the Andes. The controllers weren't aware of the mistake, and they cleared him to continue flying to prepare for landing. Sadly, they were not able to contact the aircraft after that. On October 13th at 3:30 p.m., the plane lost its right wing and then its left after striking a mountain. Soon after, it crashed into a secluded valley in Argentina near the Chilean border. A search was on its way, but it became futile after it was determined that the last reported location was wrong. The efforts were then brought to the Andes, but finding the aircraft was very difficult due to its white color sitting in snow-covered mountains. Since the weather was so extreme, rescuers assumed that there were no survivors. The search went on for 8 days and was later cancelled. Afterwards, family members continued the search on their own. The crash itself killed 12 people, which left 33 survivors. They faced a large amount of snow and freezing temperatures at an altitude of 11,500 feet, 3,500 meters. It was revealed that the aircraft was mainly intact, yet did nothing to provide protection from the weather for its passengers. Their food supply was gone within a week, and after the remaining people discussed it heavily, they decided to eat the remains of the deceased. They faced more struggles on October 29th after an avalanche struck the aircraft and filled it with snow, which resulted in 8 more deaths. Several survivors had been scouting the region for an escape route throughout this period. With only 16 people left alive, on December 12th, 3 survivors headed off for aid. On December 20th, the other 2 guys arrived at the Chilean settlement Los Metenes after a rough journey. The Chileans, on the other hand, were on the other side of a river, the noise of which made it difficult to hear. They decided to come back the next day. The survivors and the people from the town communicated by writing notes on paper, which they wrapped around a rock and tossed over the river. "I came from an aircraft that crashed in the mountains," the survivors' first message stated. The authorities came, and 2 helicopters were dispatched to the wreckage on December 22nd. 6 survivors were taken to safety, but poor weather delayed the rescue of the remaining 8 until the next day. The fact that the survivors were forced to commit cannibalism caused a media uproar. They were receiving a large amount of heat until one of the survivors said that the Last Supper inspired them, in which Jesus handed his followers bread and wine that he declared to be his flesh and blood. The public ended up swayed, and the church absolved them. What do you think you would do in this situation? Let us know in the comments. 2. EGYPTAIR Flight 990. Flight 990 left Los Angeles and quickly stopped in New York City before heading to Cairo. The aircraft was a Boeing 767-366 and was equipped with 2 crews for the 10-hour flight. It took off at 1:20 a.m. from John F. Kennedy Airport. The plane reached its designated height of 33,000 feet in less than 25 minutes, 10,000 meters. At roughly 1:50 a.m., it started to swiftly plummet at an extremely steep angle of 40 degrees to 16,000 feet, 4,900 meters. The aircraft reached the speed of sound during its drop, which is significantly beyond the safe speed for a Boeing 767. The drop came to an end less than a minute later. Afterward, the airplane made it back to a normal height, 25,000 feet, 7,600 meters, and they altered their direction. Sadly, again, it began another fall, this time catastrophic. The plane lost its left engine, lost power, and plunged into the ocean. All 203 passengers and 14 crew members were killed. A significant contingent of Egyptian military commanders returning from a training exercise in the United States were among the passengers. Their attendance initially prompted some to believe that the flight had been targeted by Egypt's enemies. International aviation treaties granted Egypt the authority to investigate the incident, but Egypt first appealed to the American National Transportation Safety Board. More than 70% of the plane was recovered from 230 feet of water, 70 meters. According to the cockpit voice recorder, the relief first officer, Gamil al-Batouti, took the co-pilot seat at his own request barely 22 minutes after takeoff. When the captain exited the cockpit to use the bathroom, the autopilot was turned off and the aircraft began its initial descent. The drop was so quick that it felt like the airplane was in zero gravity. The captain was able to return to the cockpit and say, "What's happening? What's happening?" As the rate of the drop slowed, the left and right elevators became set in opposing directions. Ascent on the left, the captain's side, and descent on the right, the co-pilot's side. About 15 seconds before the electrical system failed and flight data recording ended, the engines were turned off. The NTSB blamed the disaster on al-Batouti and his decisions. 1. Amelia Earhart's plane. Amelia Earhart took a historical transatlantic trip in 1928. She went across the Atlantic Ocean on the aircraft Friendship with pilot Bill Stoltz and co-pilot Slim Gordon. Amelia was the flight's navigator. The plane landed in Wales on June 18, 1928, after 21 hours of flight. She was the very first woman to fly across the Atlantic. Earhart was hailed as a hero upon her return to the United States. The next time, she decided she wanted to make the same trip, but by herself. She hopped into her red single-engine Lockheed Vega airplane on May 20, 1932, and was on her way from Harbour Grace, Newfoundland. Her plan was to make the same trip that Charles Lindbergh took 5 years before by flying to Paris, France. The thick clouds and her windshield and wings covered with ice made the flight overall pretty risky. She did succeed in crossing the Atlantic 14 hours later, but had to land early in a cow pasture in Londonderry, Northern Ireland. She had become the second person to fly over the Atlantic Ocean solo. She went on to receive multiple awards, such as the Distinguished Flying Cross from Congress. She broke many records over her next several years of flying. She also gave speeches and wrote about women's rights in flying. She was highly successful, yet yearned for more. She wanted to be the first woman to fly around the world. On June 1, 1937, Amelia and her navigator Fred Noonan embarked on their dream journey. They made it through a handful of flights, crossing through Africa and Asia, and then to New Guinea in the South Pacific. It was only a month later, on July 2nd, that they left New Guinea to fly to Howland Island. But sadly, they were never seen or heard from again. The government searched tirelessly for weeks, but they came up empty-handed. Many theories abound, but to this day, no one knows, and her plane is still missing. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and see ya in the next video.